Howdy, it's Mitch Kuffa here with homework. This is where we talk to you about your house and about different problems you may have or different things that we seen and seen through the years. Now, I'm a licensed builder in the state of Michigan, been for many, many years. I was a general contractor for many years. I'm an FHA inspector. I'm what they call a HUD 203K consultant for people that are buying houses and making improvements. I've inspected probably 15,000, 20,000 houses. I've built like over 3,000 of them. So I've been around a little bit, all right? I'm getting old. Also a Detroit Lions fan. I wore my Detroit Lions shirt today, which if they don't win the Super Bowl pretty soon, I'm going to not be a Lions fan anymore, okay? But today I want to talk about cleanliness, okay? It's really amazing when we inspect houses, the issues that we run across as it relates to cleanliness, okay? Some of the houses are clean inside, but dirty outside. Some of them are dirty outside, but clean inside. Some of them, there's all these little hidden areas that people don't even realize. Now I want you to get your pencils out, and I'm going to run by some of these things and talk to you briefly about them. But I want to start on the outside of the house first. And we're talking here cleanliness, but there's just all of these things, all these issues. Envision a man who wears a nice, expensive suit, $500 suit, $1,000 suit, okay? But the buttons are missing, it's wrinkled, it's dirty, the pleats aren't in the pants, something's coming apart, as opposed to the guy who's wearing a $59 suit, but it's pristine clean, everything's in place, the pleats are there, it's been goes to the laundry, obviously, recently or regularly. That's the difference, okay? You can go into a very expensive house that's a mess, or a very production grade house that's pristine, and that has impact on your brain, okay? Cleanliness is next to godliness, okay? But I want to talk about on the outside first, okay? The very first thing, before I get out of the car, when I sit in the driveway of this house, the very first thing I'm looking at is how overgrown the house is at. I know that might sound silly, but some of these houses, just people don't realize, this overgrowth has a negative impact on houses, okay? If the big trees are overgrown, they have the tendency to have their branches rub up onto the roof, or they create shade patterns where mosses builds up, and insects like the damp areas better, okay? And then the landscaping. Sometimes the people put landscaping, but they don't anticipate what this plant is going to look like at full maturity. And when it's overgrown, it starts rubbing up against the house and creating problems, and it wears out the siding and stuff like that. So overgrowth in general is a factor, okay? Storage areas also around the outside of the house. People have a tendency to, there's a detached garage, they'll pile debris up behind that because they think nobody's going to see it. Or they have a little corner of the backyard that they stack up firewood and stack up empty cans and bottles and whatever, okay? So overgrowth in general, right? Siding. I remember when they came out with wood grain siding. First we had aluminum siding, and then we had vinyl siding, and then it was wood siding, of course. It was in there. Wood, let's say first was wood, and then aluminum, but they came up with a wood grain siding on the vinyl. And everybody says, oh, isn't this beautiful? There's only one little problem with it. It has a tendency to collect dirt, okay? Also, you will find that aluminum siding has a tendency to collect dirt, and the problem with that is you've got to be so careful when you clean it because of the fact that it washes off the paint, okay? But the vinyl siding that's wood grain, I have it on my own house, and I have my house power washed every year, okay? Because of the fact of the debris and the dirt that it collects, and it's dirty look, all right? Pets. Oh boy, you want to drive up to the house, I'm sitting in the driveway, and I can see all the burn marks in the grass, and I can see the holes dug around different areas and stuff like that, okay? So you got to maintain, those areas too, especially if they're in an area where you can see it from the street, what they call that curb appeal, You want to blow your curb appeal because all your grass is all burned out from your pets urinating in those areas, and it's defecating, okay? But pets can cause a lot of damage if they're not taken care of and maintained and followed up on, okay? Gutters, oh gosh, gutters are just such an issue. Gutters are, if you live in a wooded area, they're really a pain because of all the leaves that come off the trees. If you live in a non-wooded area, see, the problem with gutters is that they're great. You need to discharge the roof water. The roof is a large area, and the roof sheds a lot of water when it rains hard, okay? And you do not want that water running right next to the house. You want that water dispersed away from the house, at least 3 or 4 feet if possible, okay? But if you don't take care of your gutters, you know, you get into any kind of rain and it has a tendency to overflow. And there's nothing worse than pulling up in the driveway and seeing things growing out of the gutters. You know, little plants growing and little vines. That means that they're really dirty, okay? They now have these gutter screens, which are great items. You know, they were quite expensive. They're coming down in price and being more competitive. You know, they're terrific. But again, you got to keep the gutters clean because you got to keep the water discharged away. Another thing about when you have dirty gutters, it has a tendency to overflow on not only the ground around the perimeter house, but the decks around the perimeter house, of the decks and the sidewalks and everything else. And it, believe it or not, over the end, I always have that old saying, water will win in the end. You know, you can't have water just discharging like a little waterfall off your house and not being intercepted to discharge it away from the house. Because if it's discharging right next to the house, it's going to get into the house. It's going to get into the basement. It's going to go under your porch and cause problems and stuff like that, okay? So gutters need to be cleaned, okay? Another area that people often forget, and we run when we do inspections, we always look in these areas, is fireplace chimneys. You know, people just don't think of it. It's out of sight, out of mind, so they just don't realize that when you're burning, whatever you're burning in your fireplace, whether it's wood or coal or whatever it is, that causes a residue up into your chimney that can become, you know, it sets on fire. You know, when you're in the middle of the winter and you got a big roaring fire in your fireplace, you know, if you could stick your head in there in the fire and look up the chimney, you'd see that a lot of times the inside of the chimney is burning too, okay? And that obviously could be considered a fire hazard, especially on older fireplaces, because older fireplaces don't have chimney liners. They just have the brick from the chimney. And that brick, over a period of time, has a tendency, the mortar wears out from the heat, falls out, the bricks become loose and become a fire hazard. So if you have an older chimney, it's especially important to get it clean, possibly put a flue liner inside the chimney, depends, you know, and chimney caps are cool. And the big thing is make sure you also adjust your dampers. Those dampers a lot of times very dirty, and you gotta, when that fire goes out, you gotta shut that damper, because that chimney, the higher the chimney, the more suction it has. Okay, so if you got a 2-story chimney and the fireplace is off and the damper is open, it's sucking the hot air right out of your house. You know, and one-story chimney does the same, but just not as fast. All right, so you want to make sure that your chimneys are cleaned once in a while by a professional chimney cleaner. That's another thing. You know, this is not a do-it-yourself job. You need a chimney cleaner. Windows. You know, people don't realize windows theoretically are to provide light, to provide ventilation, and to provide exit if there's an emergency. You know, every room that's on the outside of the house is supposed to have a window that opens where you can get out of the house if you can't get out of the front door for some reason. Let's say there's a fire or a tornado or whatever, a flood. You know, you got to be able to escape from the house in an emergency. Okay, so the windows have to be functional. You know, it's amazing how often, especially like casement windows, you know, the ones that crank out with the cranks, you know, over gravity. See, the gravity has a tendency to pull those down over the years and years, and then they don't fit that right, or they start sticking on those little tracks. Okay, and sliding windows too are just that's an amazing area of, I don't want to say neglect, but people just don't think about it. They don't think about cleaning or lubricating the tracks on their windows to make sure they open and close, so that you got ventilation, and especially like people with central air. Crack me up, they just never open their windows. A lot of them think they don't have to open their windows all summer, as opposed to, you know, allowing some of that fresh air into the house, breathing air, okay, keeping everything clean. All right, so windows are another area that very often are dirty. Now, if you got insulated windows, you know, the ones with 2 panes of glass, a lot of times they're steamed up inside. If they're steamed up inside, they're not working. They're not working as insulated glass. You know, the air is getting in between the 2 panels of glass, and it's not functioning to the maximum efficiency that it could be functioning. Okay, so window maintenance is a very important item. Cleaning it inside out, lubricating, adjusting, etc. Okay. The old roof of your house. Oh boy. You know, every time we pretty much talk about it, just about every session we talk here about the roof. You know, the roof is what protects your entire property. Okay. You cannot have, like I said earlier, you cannot have branches from trees rubbing up against it. You can't have branches laying all over it. You know, you shouldn't have moss growing up on it any more than necessary. You know, in general, you know, it has to be kept clean of debris. You know, you can't put a lot of debris up on a roof. Like, debris typically comes from mostly, in most cases, the trees in the area. Okay, leaves and stuff like that. If the gutters aren't working, a lot of times that stuff backs up onto the roof. Also, you know, the debris. But in general, the roof is very important because one of the big items too is it's expensive. So by not keeping it clean and maintaining it and letting the sunlight and the air get into it to keep it kind of dry when it's supposed to be dry, it's going to shorten its life expectancy. And in today's market, it's not uncommon at all to see roofs $12,000, $20,000. Depends how big your house is, okay? How big your overhangs are. Okay, and roofs also need to be vented. Vented, okay? So you got to keep the debris off and keep the debris away from the vents so that they can actually work the way they're supposed to work, right? Oh boy. Fences. Let me tell you about fences again. It's so often, we drive up to the house and we can't even get into the backyard because the gate don't work. Because it's rusted shut, or it's not been maintained again. Or the perimeter fences are totally overgrown, which is okay. It kind of gives you a little privacy and stuff like that, but it's not meant to be that way. You're supposed to actually trim that back so that you can, utilize the fences as they said. Because a lot of times you cut that debris back and you'll find the fences are sagging, they're moving, they're not stable, they're rusting again, but people never maintain their fences the way they're supposed to. And fences last a long time. I mean, fences, if it's a metal fence, it'll last 20, 30 years. If it's a wood fence, maybe a little less than that, But in the meantime, you just can't neglect it. It has to be, if it's a wood fence, it needs to be painted or stained, preferably, okay? Because otherwise, it's going to be worn by the weather, and the sunlight's going to bleach it, and the rain is going to get it all wet, okay? So fences is very common. Gates are just very commonly found to be non-functional, okay? Because of neglecting it. Decks. Let's talk about decks. Wood decks. Now they got these laminate decks, which I'm not really sure. I'm not real crazy about. But the biggest problem with the decks is underneath them. Remember, we're talking about cleanliness here. We're talking about cleanliness. If on top of the deck, if you use it, you're going to sweep it off, clean it for your debris and stuff like that. But people have a tendency not to look under their deck, And it's amazing what you find under decks. Because, see, the biggest problem with a deck is it creates shadow underneath for the earth that's under your deck. And depending on what type of soil you have, that soil, it rains. The water is designed to run through the deck to underneath. Now the underneath is all wet, but it's shadowed, so the sun's not getting in it. So it either stays wet, or it absorbs that area, or saturates that area. And if you got a clay soil, it becomes very heavy, and it puts pressure on your basement walls. And if it's just any kind of soil, it's amazing what you find living under your deck. And again, a lot of these little animals, raccoons and squirrels and ground burrowing creatures are underneath your deck, And a lot of times you find things growing under there that maybe you don't want to growing under there. I don't know if you really want mushrooms growing under your deck, or you want some sort of vegetation that you don't even know what it is growing underneath there. So make sure those areas are clean. I always recommend putting a sheet of plastic over the ground, because that then protects it from getting saturated, and it discourages it from getting saturated, and it discourages things that like to dig holes not to be able to dig the holes, right? So that's an area that is commonly neglected, okay? I think lastly here in this session here, I want to talk about garages, okay? Because garages are sort of like the outside of the house. Garages, I don't know, I've been in houses where they're just pristine, but the majority of them are not, okay? The majority of them are, that's where you stack all your paint. That's where you stack all your tools. That's where you park your cars. That's where the cars leak oil. That's where different things happen inside the garage. That's where it has this huge door that lets all the elements in and out, okay? So, the garage, if you very common to find peeling paint in the garage. Oh, boy, peeling paint, we'll talk about that in another session again. But, that's lead-based paint concerns if the house is older than 1978. 1978 is when they brought up the big thing about lead-based paint and how it's poisonous and how it can hurt you and all that other stuff, right? Holes in the firewall is very common to find in garages, Firewalls are the first 10 foot of garage that is attached to your house is supposed to be protected by a firewall. And that firewall is not supposed to have holes in it. It's not supposed to have the tape on the drywall coming off or anything like that. It's supposed to be fire rated so that if a fire starts, it can't go burn into the house. All right? The doors got to be working again, The doors in your house and the garage have to be functional. They're supposed to seal, So when you close them on the house, you're not seeing wind or light coming in. The garage is a little different. But in the meantime, very commonly that the garage doors need adjustment. They're not closing straight, or there's a weather stripping on the sides that's falling off and stuff like that. All right. That's pretty much it. There's brick. We can talk about brick. Brick. Again, if you don't have gutters, or you don't take care of your gutters, it's not uncommon to see, well, driving top, I see it all the time, a brick house, and for some unknown reason, the bottom 5 or 6 courses of brick are showing wear and deterioration. Why is that? Because the gutters are leaking, pouring they splashing up on the brick gets absorbed, and then it gets impacted by frost, or, in our area here in Michigan especially, we have 100-degree temperature change between summer and winter sometimes, depends, you can't have the brick getting saturated. Brick is like a hard sponge, okay? And then things grow on it, And then I see when these guys, a lot of times they patch it and they tuck point it, they don't clean it afterwards. And it looks horrible then, it does have no curb appeal. So your brick is another issue that, you need to, it's an area that you just can't walk away from and think that there's not a problem, all right? That's really it for now. And then we're going to talk in the future about the interior cleanliness areas, okay? But these are all areas that you got to take care of. You guys can't ignore them. It's nice to sit on your porch and you can sit in the sun and all that kind of stuff, but you got to take care of stuff, or it doesn't get better, it gets worse. It's like a tooth, that if you have a decay there, you don't get that thing taken care of, it's going to get better. It's not going to get better. Okay, this is Mitch Kuffa, and this program was presented to you by the Blue Water Healthy Living, sponsored by the Grant Smith Health Insurance Agency, and produced by the famous GBS Media. Thanks. I'll see you next time.